Three scriptures I want to read. Um, and one is in Proverbs, chapter 16, verse 9. Then we're going to be in Jeremiah. And then we'll turn to the book of Romans. If you'll stand with me tonight, reading of God's Word. In Proverbs chapter 16, and just one verse, it says, "A man's heart deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps." Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, it says this, it says that, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee. And I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations." Romans chapter 12, verse 8, it says that, "Or he that exhorteth on exhortation, he that giveth, let him do it with simplicity. He that ruleth with diligence. He that sheweth mercy with cheerfulness." I like what Jeremiah said. He said, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations." Lord, will you help me tonight? Will you be with us, Lord, as we, mighty God, Lord, share some thoughts. I need your help, and I'm asking this in the name of Jesus. Amen. You may be seated. Tomorrow, is there school tomorrow? No school tomorrow. Wow. Do you know why you don't have school tomorrow? President's Day. What does President's Day represent? Why are you getting tomorrow off? In most cases, President's Day is a federal holiday. In 1879, it was officially made, and it was a federal holiday actually to honor all of the men who have served as presidents of the United States. It has been more commonly, depends on what state and how they elected that they, whether or not, but in most general, it has become honoring Abraham Lincoln and George Washington's birthday. But in most respect, it's more of honoring our first president, George Washington. And I believe it's appropriate tonight because of our time that we're living in. I believe that there are individuals tonight that if they could, they would take a big racer and they would race out so much of our beginning, especially our history. Even with this individual tonight, even though he is recognized as our first president, if you look on the internet and Google his name, you'll probably find a different version of facts about him than what I am going to attempt to tell tonight. And one of the things that I'm sure you will read about him, and one that is becoming very popular in this present time, and one that it would not surprise me that there are some individuals that would like to exclude him from this holiday, is for the fact that he was owned slaves. I'm I as anyone, I believe that was a blight on our American history. I do believe that it was something but our country paid the price for that. We had thousands of our young men who gave their lives fighting for the freedom that terrible thing was taking place. They don't even want to credit that. They have an agenda, and the agenda is they don't want to acknowledge certain individuals and what part they had in our country, and for the most part, they do not want to acknowledge God's intervention in our country. If there is ever an American, ever a person of interest, that I believe without a shadow of a doubt, I believe that George Washington would have been that individual. And I would like to tell you some things about him tonight. And I would like to tell you maybe some stories that convinces me that this man had God's hand. Now, there are those, it depends on who you read, what you will find about this man. President's Day is also in 1932. It's tribute to a badge. The military created a badge of merit for the common soldier, and this was done on this day, and that badge was and has the image. If you're awarded this badge, has the image of George Washington on the medal. And this badge is one that probably, if you've had any part of the military, especially if you served during wartime, this badge is given to anyone, any soldier who is wounded in combat, and it is better known as the Purple Heart. And so this Purple Heart is given to any soldier that is wounded in battle. There are many individuals that have received multiple Purple Hearts for their sacrifice and for their act of service. And usually, even in today's army, in the conflicts that our nation had just in Afghanistan and also in Iraq, when our American soldiers are wounded, sometime in their recovery, a officer or general or someone will visit them and award them with this medal, and it is a medal that's given to them because of their sacrifice that they gave for our country. Since 1862, during the Civil War, a tradition uh, was in the that has been done in the Senate. As far as I know, it continues. That on I believe it is President's Day, since 1862, but it was on the birthday of George Washington. A George Washington's farewell speech that he gave at the at the end of his 2 terms as president. Some facts about him that I'd like to talk about tonight, and what he contribute to our country. There's 3 major things that George Washington did for the United States. He served he served as the commanding general of the Continental Army that was formed out of the desire of July the 4th, when the Declaration of Independence, he was appointed by that Congress to be the general that would be over the American referred to by many American rebels, or the of the men who would fight for our liberty. He's also contributed. He was the president that presided. He was not the president of the United States, but he was the one who presided over the Constitution Convention that was held, I believe it was in Philadelphia, that came up with our Constitution. He presided over that. And then his third contribution to our nation was he was our first president, and he was elected by the Electoral College, and he was elected in 2 terms to serve as our president. He was born on February the 11th, 1731, and his birthplace was a place called Pope's Creek Estate near Colonial Beach in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was born to his mother. His father's name was Augustine. His mother's name was Mary Ball Washington, and he came from a family with 6 kids. And when his father passed away, he inherited a farm and with 10 slaves. At the age of 17, George Washington got his surveyor license. He was a surveyor by trade, and believe it or not, he is given credit for doing surveys throughout Virginia, but also in our very local area. One of the things that I remember from my first grade teacher that she brought out was that Route 50. Everybody familiar with Route 50? I'm sure you have driven up and down that road sometime or another. You might have even been on it this evening coming to church. George Washington was part of a survey crew that laid out some of the road that we now know. He's known. He did a lot of surveying. He became the county survey, I believe, for the county of Culpeper in Virginia. He was that, and George Washington, as I said, he visited our area not only as a surveyor, but he also probably visited our area during the French and Indian War. I know definitely he traveled through what we know as Cumberland, and everyone, have you ever heard of a fort called Fort Necessity? He was the one who helped build that fort. It's somewhere up around Grantsville or somewhere in that area. I believe it's in Pennsylvania actually, but he's known for that. He married a woman, a widow. Her name was Martha, and when she was a widow, and very wealthy widow because of her husband, and she was 27 years old, and when he married her, he became co-owners of a very, very wealthy plantation, and him and Martha, she no doubt she was the one who managed his farm. When when he moved to Mount Vernon, and that's just laying some foundations about George Washington. One of the debates of George Washington that I believe that is very important to express, and it depends on who you read, whether or not what was his faith. Was George Washington a Christian? After reading many stories of those yays and nays, if you looking at modern history, you won't find that George Washington's was much in the act of faith. But there are historians that has been discovered by other historians that have found great evidence that George Washington was a man of faith, a man that he was, and I can't pronounce the what his religion was, but he was common to visit a church, two churches. One was 7 miles from his home, and one was 10 miles in Alexandria, Virginia. And he was a member. One, he was a deacon. Some would want to say that during his lifetime that he did not mention Jesus in his writings. If you look at some of the things that he contributed, he referred to God by many names, and he did use God's name as the God of providence, and there is a lot of debates. Some of the legends that has come out of George Washington's was if you I know in a kid that I remember reading this in school, learning this in school, of his story of the cherry tree. And the legend goes that when George was 6 years old, he was given a hatchet as a gift. And they say that little George liked to go around hacking and doing things around the farm. And in his garden, in their garden, he was doing things with his hatchet, and his father had a favorite cherry tree. And supposedly George Washington hacked that cherry tree. Well, when George's dad found out about that, of course he was upset and wanted to know who damaged his cherry tree. And the story says that George came in about that time, and his father asked him if George knew anything about the cherry tree. And George said, "Father, I can't lie to you. I was the one that cut the cherry tree down." Now, most people want to say that that was just a make-up story, and it probably could have been. But it was in essence that, and his father, instead of punishing him, said that that he wished that 1,000 would be like George, of telling the truth. And the moral of that story is, regardless, I try to pound that into some people I know very well, that if you're confronted about something, you're better off tell the truth. Sometimes just want the information of what happened. But when you don't tell the truth, you make a whole different situation out of it. And but anyway, there's another story that I just discovered this week, that George's father and mother, that they both were religious. And it is said that his mother admonished George before he left home. He says, she's told him, she says, "Remember that God is our only sure trust. To him I commend you," she added. "My son, neglect not the duty of secret prayer." George Washington was encouraged by his mother to be prayer. Now, there are accounts. Let me, before I get ahead of myself, George's father died when George was very young. He was only 11 years old. So, and they say that George's father planted some plants in the form of George's name. And when those plants began to grow, that George's father took him and showed him this wonderful thing of George's name. And he asked George, he said, George, he said, was this something that just happened, or was it by design? And George said, supposedly said, that there is no way that could have done on its own. It had to have someone who designed that. And then his father showed him the surrounding fields and the hills and the trees. And he said, George, he said, that just didn't happen. That was done by design. Now, whether or not that is part of George's life, but the question is, was George Washington a man of prayer? That question was asked many times. It was asked by individuals in his family, and his nephew had reported the fact that he witnessed every day, early in the morning and in evening, George Washington reading scriptures and praying. And he did this on a daily basis. Now, as any individual, there were things that about George. George was a human, just like we are. He had faults. There's some things that trouble me. They say that George was a member of the Freemasons. I, as a Christian, look at that and my opinion of that society. But regardless, there are witnesses let's say, depends on who you read, that says that George Washington was seen praying at Valley Forge. Now, if you visit some of these sites and you ask questions about Mount Vernon and ask questions at the park at Valley Forge, you're probably going to be told that was not true and made up, because that's what our modern history wants to preside. Now, I believe personally, not only did people witness, but people even heard on the night, and I will talk about that just in a minute, on the night that he's famous for, when he crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night in December of 1776. Men heard him reciting the Lord's Prayer as he traveled across that frozen river that night. I believe, brothers and sisters, that regardless of what, he was a man who acknowledged God and gave God credit. Now, here I like to talk about the fortune of George Washington. I believe George Washington was a man of fortune. Now, in the wealth sense, George Washington, he owned thousands of acres. He was very wealthy. He was a planter. He was a plantation owner. Had a big farms in Virginia. He belonged to the House of Burgesses. He was a member of the House of Burgesses. Served in the House of Burgesses in the state capital at that time was Williamsburg, Virginia. He was there. But the fortune that I believe that's outstanding was some things that George got involved in that I believe without intervention from someone greater than George wouldn't have survived. And one of those incidents happened in 1755, 10 miles upriver from Fort Donahue, I believe is better known as where the city of Pittsburgh is. George Washington was with a regiment of some of Britain's finest, about 1,500 of the British Redcoats, led by General Braddock. He was a colonel serving as an aide for this British general. And they were on a mission to rout out the French occupation of that part of the frontier. As they traveled toward the fort, George pleaded with General Braddock to send out scouts, Indian scouts, to check out and to get information. General Braddock, for whatever reason, refused. He did not trust the Indians, so he did not do that. George also pleaded with the general not to fight in the traditional way that Britain, these soldiers was trained to fight. In warfare at that time, when battles took place, the armies would march out in rank and they would face each other and they would fire their rifles at each other. And that's how they fought the battles. On this day, the British soldiers would be shocked. And because of the method of what they faced that day, and probably a very smaller, superior force that they were facing with the Indians and the French, they come to realize that the warfare in the frontier was totally different from the battlefields of Europe, where they were knowing the fight against countries as Germany and France. But on that day, as they traveled, they were routed by an ambush. They found themselves surrounded by Indians and by French soldiers who did not reveal themselves. They were hiding behind rocks and trees. Years later, an Indian chief that was there that day, that participated in that rout, here is what he said. He said, "Our rifles were leveled at Washington. Rifles which but for him knew not how to miss. 'Twas was all in vain." He said that they were aiming at a certain individual, and a certain individual they were aiming at was George Washington. And he says, "A power mightier far than we shielded him from harm. He cannot die in battle." Listen, the Great Spirit protects that man and guides his destiny. He will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will honor him as founder of a mighty empire. That was words that was written and said by, at that day, an enemy. On that day, as the British soldiers found themselves in battle, they tried to fight the enemy as they were trained, and they were slaughtered. 2/3 of their numbers went down that day. 1/3 of their officers fell to the ground, wounded or died. And even their commanding general, General Braddock, was shot and 2 days later passed away. But on that day, there was an individual that was on a horse. And in that battle, he was riding amongst the British soldiers, rallying them, trying to keep them in order, trying to keep them from panicking, trying to do all that he could to keep the battle from being completely a massacre. That day, he would end that day not on his original horse. On that day, he would have 3 horses, for 2 of them was shot out from under him. On that day, he did everything he could to keep those that are alive. It came to the place where the British soldiers finally panicked and retreated and fled the scene. He, under fire, helped to get the British general, off the field of danger. In that evening, around a campfire, as the survivors were sitting there, with the cries and the moans and groans of the dying wounded, George Washington took off his outer garments, and discovering 2 holes that was in his outer garment. 2 holes. People looked and was astonished. Wow. Taking off his hat, there was a hole in his hat. That's history. That's truth. The modern historian won't mention it, but they can't refute it, for too many people saw it. That's why this Indian said what he said years later. They did everything in their power that day to bring that man to the ground. Someone was there protecting him. Someone had their hand upon George Washington. Why am I taking a religious service, and talking about a civil servant? Is because, brothers and sisters, I believe this man needs to be honored and respected for what he was. He had a mission. He had a purpose. And God used him to be our deliverer. There's another story that's told about George Washington. And this happened in the summer of 1776. Now, something very important that we all acknowledge happened in the year of 1776. Would anyone want to try to attempt what is better known as 1776? What's 1776 known for? A certain day. Independence Day. On what day? 4th of July. That's when you eat your hot dogs and shoot off your firecrackers. And that was the day that, what's that? And chicken, yes, because I work that day. Unless it happens on Saturday and Sunday. But that's the Constitution. But at that time, George Washington was serving as the general of the Continental Army. He took over the army of what army they had while the British occupied Boston. But General Howe realized that Boston was not a good town to be in. And so he decided to move the British Army south. And what an army General Howe had. General Howe had over 32,000 soldiers. He had over 8,000 Hessian German mercenaries that was hired by the British government to fight for the British Empire to put down this rebellion happening in the colonies. He had over 10,000 sailors. He had over 70 warships and hundreds of transports, boats for supplies. And they moved into the harbor of New York, as known as New York City today. George Washington, with a ragtag army of around 10,000, maybe 12,000 men, was facing this opposing army. Without too much ado, the British Army was putting pressure on George Washington. Now, when George Washington got a copy of the Constitution, the letter of independence, he read it to his soldiers. But this was not a good time for George Washington. George Washington never had too many victories. He was constantly one step away of being totally wiped out by this superior army. He found himself in August. He found himself trapped on Long Island and in Manhattan. It was known as Manhattan and Long Island today. He found himself trapped. Had the British Army on one side and had water on the other. He had nowhere to go. He was near to being wiped out. His army, he had never had a chance. And then in August, I believe it was around August 29th, George Washington realized that the only way he could survive, he had to escape. But there was only one danger about it. There's only one way he could escape, and that was by water. And his army would have been open to the warships, would have been open to the British, and it would have been almost next to impossible to do it. But George Washington decided that it had to be done. So on the night of August the 29th, 1776, he got some help from men who knew how about transporting by boat. And his quartermaster, and had his quartermaster gather up all the boats that they could get. They wrapped the oars that night in cloth so the British sentries could not hear them as they attempted to escape across the water. It was a very dangerous thing George Washington was attempting to do. Can you imagine? He had 10,000 to 12,000 men, not only men, but cannons and supplies to get out of harm's way. But that night around 8 o'clock, they started shipping. They first took the horses over. Now, horses are like any animals. They make noise. But that night, they didn't make no sound. He had part of his rear guard on the heights surrounding the harbor. He had those guards keep the fires up in camp, so to trick the British in thinking that George's army was in camp. But while they were masquerading that, George Washington was transporting his men. But as the night grew shorter and morning approached, there were many men left, still to cross that river, still in harm's way. They say that George Washington was one of the last to get in the boat. But as the morning broke and the daylight began to shine, where the British could see what the Americans was attempting, unknowing, a very, 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 very thick fog fell upon the land, and you couldn't see. But it gave George Washington the time that he needed to get all the remaining American soldiers out of harm's way. Why was that important? Because if the British would have discovered what was happening, we might not have had what we have today. But George Washington escaped to fight another day. And another day he would have. He didn't have too many victories. That fall was a terrible fall. He was pursued by the British and kept. But as the year began to end and December came upon him, George Washington found himself once again in great peril. They had no supplies. They didn't have they didn't have shoes for many of their soldiers. Many of their soldiers were barefooted. Their clothes were rags. They had no blankets and no shelters. And he was not only facing that crisis, but he was also facing a situation that at the end of 1776, many of his men's enlistment would be up. And many of those men would be leaving the army. And George Washington was not in a place to lose any men. But George had done something that he has become known for. George established a plan that is known today as one of the most wonderful things that helped him. George needed information. It's very important when you're fighting the enemy to know as much as you can about the enemy. Where is the enemy? How strong is the enemy? Where are their weaknesses? What information George found? George set up a spy ring that has now become known as the Culpeper Spy Ring. They was named after the county in Virginia, Culpeper. These individuals stayed behind in New York. They disguised themselves as British loyalists, but in essence, they were the information center. These men came up with ways to track where the British was. They knew the strength of the British. They knew if a regiment moved here or moved there. They knew what towns and what strength these towns had when it came to the British. It was a very dangerous mission that these men were doing. But they had methods. They used invisible ink. They used couriers, men who risked their lives traveling in and out of the British lines, feeding George Washington with vital information. And some of the vital information George Washington found was that in a town in Trenton, New Jersey, there was a regiment of Hessian soldiers, and they were vulnerable for a surprise attack. So once again, George decided that to get the morale of his army up, because morale was low, men were discouraged, he decided to make a very unlikely attack at a very unlikely time, and he did it on Christmas. He gathered up his army. He had 3 groups that he wanted to send across the river. George Washington took his cannons, he took his horses, and he took his men. He broke them up in 3 different groups. 2 of those groups could not. One got caught in an ice jam that kept them from fulfilling their mission. The other, for whatever reason, was not able to meet the timeline that George needed. George had to get his army across the Delaware River on a winter night with the wind blowing and snow coming down. He had to cross this river with these men, and the group that George Washington had was something like 2,700 men, and he got them across the river. But as they got across the river, they had one thing. He had to attack Trenton by morning, but he had 8 miles to make it to Trenton. And so he pressed his men to march in a snowstorm and march toward Trenton, New Jersey, where his enemy was. The enemy had some warnings. They ignored. I believe Brother Jeffries mentioned that one of the generals was given a telegram or a message that they knew that something was going to happen that night. But the Germans were in their warm homes that they occupied in Trenton, having their dinners and parties, and went unawares that an enemy was approaching them. As George Washington rode his horse that night, and through the conditions that began to get worse, trying to press his men forward with all speed, he realized that they were behind schedule. He was pressing his men. He became aware of a little drummer boy who was so exhausted that he laid down in the snow and fell asleep. He hollered for men around him to wake that little man up and to get him on his feet. He got him awoke, and they said that as they got him awoke, George Washington, as he was galloping on his horse, the men witnessed that his horse stumbled in the storm and went to fall to the ground in danger of crushing this general under the weight of his horse. They say that George dropped the reins of his horse, grabbed the mane of the horse, the hair behind the head, and grabbed a hold of that horse, and with his own strength, he pulled that horse back up and kept him from stumbling. Now, brothers and sisters, those are stories that gives me goosebumps. And the story is, did we see what we just saw? The little drummer boy, I think, mentioned there was the soldiers around him. And the report was no one was going to keep that man from reaching Trenton. The sleet began to fall with the snow. The sleet was so thick and blinding that it was next to in blizzard conditions that George Washington moved his men towards Trenton. Daylight came, and the danger of discovery became, it was going to happen. But because of the storm, because of the intensity of the storm, the sentries decided that nothing was going to take place that was protecting Trenton, and they all went inside. I don't know why I'm talking to that thing. I think that thing would work. That's why I'm talking to this thing. Isn't that amazing? I knew what to do. But George Washington, and I got to hurry or I'm going to miss my 250 steps before 8 o'clock. I'm about done. I just want to tell you about George Washington. But you know what? They made it to Trenton that day, that morning. The sentries went inside, didn't think nothing was going to happen, to hear gunfire begin to erupt. Instead of staying under cover and shooting out the windows like a smart man would, they all rushed outside to be slaughtered by George Washington's men, who picked them off. And George Washington defeated a very well-equipped German army and put them to rout that day. There are other stories I could tell you about George Washington, but I believe, brothers and sisters, that I told you enough that if anything, that you should realize what a great man. And I am glad that he was our first president, and I believe he was a worthy leader. Amen. Now tomorrow, when you're playing whatever you might be playing or doing whatever you might be doing and enjoying a day off from school, I'll be working in the chicken factory because we don't get that day off. And but you know what? We're starting to get a notion in this country to honor some men and forget others. And that's why I'll risk my ministry tonight and want to tell you about, and I know I'm not risking it, but what I'm telling you is I want to tell you about a man I don't want to forget, a man that we need to honor, a man worthy of honor for what he contributed for the founding of our country. Will you stand with me?